I'll get back to the schedule, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roxana Daneshjou, who's joining us from a very early time zone. So we're very happy to have her. Dr. Daneshjou received her undergraduate degree at Rice University in bioengineering. She then completed her MD PhD at Stanford, during which time she was awarded several fellowships. And she completed dermatology residency at Stanford in the research track, and now practices dermatology as a clinical scholar in Stanford's Department of Dermatology, and also conducts AI research in biomedical data science. Her research interests are in developing diverse data sets and fair algorithms for applications in dermatology and AI. And we are very happy to have her talk about it to us today. We'd also say congratulations, as she recently signed an agreement for a tenure track faculty position at Stanford in biomedical data science and dermatology. So congratulations on that. And with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to Dr. Daneshjou.
Thank you very much.
I'll unshare.
I love that you guys can discuss having stuff in a castle. That's not something we often can discuss here, because we don't really have that many castles. Oh, okay. So I know that I was asked to talk specifically about my paper in JAMA Dermatology on data sets, and I will cover that paper as well. But I think like the larger, broader theme here, I would like to talk about challenges with equipoise and fairness in AI ML data sets in dermatology. And I have, several papers kind of in this space. And so I actually cover a bit from all of them, kind of paint a story for you about sort of where we're at today and where I hope we will start to go as a field. So there is this fantastic TED Talk that I suggest everybody watches if you're interested about the practice of dermatology, particularly as it pertains in the United States. I know this is a very international group, but at least in the US, we know that a lot of our bias in artificial intelligence comes from biases and systemic racism that already exist in our medical system. And Dr. Jenna Lester at UCSF gives this fantastic TED Talk where she talks about why skin disease is often misdiagnosed in dark skin tones. And I think that if you want to have an understanding of just sort of how things are done in the medical system in the US in dermatology, this is a very helpful talk, because of course, when we're building data sets coming from a medical system, and the US is one of those systems that does generate a lot of data sets that people all over the world end up using. And of course, global diversity in data sets is an important topic too, not one that I will specifically talk on today, but obviously is important for having, a representation of different countries and different populations, and even, different disease frequencies that happen across, the globe. And so my concern in my research is about how existing biases in medicine might get coded into technological advances. And by biases here, I'm specifically concerned about differential performance on classes such as race or gender, sensitive attributes, and this can contribute to systemic healthcare disparities if we apply these technologies. And today I'll mostly focus on biases in data sets. However, I want to acknowledge that that is not the only way that biases appear within AI systems. There can be biased task design, and I'll give one example of that, like, for example, the kinds of diseases that might get represented in AI algorithms. And of course, there's this concern about biases that get amplified by algorithms. And the best example of this was published by Ziad Obermeyer in a paper in Science in 2019, where he looked at a system implemented in the US that was supposed to give guidance on which patients might need extra resources upon discharge from the hospital. And what they found is that the algorithm differentially recommended more resources for white patients compared to Black patients who had the same amount of illness. And the reason is because they were using healthcare spending as a proxy for illness. And in the US, because we don't have equal access to care like there is in other countries, white patients were getting more access to care and more healthcare spending, and therefore then having more resources diverted towards them by this algorithm, which was actually just amplifying an existing healthcare disparity. So just wanted to kind of go through different avenues and aspects that bias can come into the system, though as I mentioned today, mostly focused on the data set aspect of the problem. And one of the first seminal papers looking at these biases in these AI systems was by Joy Balamweni and Timnit Gibru, where they found that commercial AI algorithms that were supposed to predict gender, which in and of itself is, a task that has some issues around it, but there were companies that have these gender predictor algorithms, and they found that these algorithms performed significantly worse on Black women. And so this was kind of the seminal paper that sort of launched this field of worrying about AI bias, AI data sets. And I think, this paper has been an inspiration to many people who work in this field. It is called the Gender Shades paper, and it was published in 2018. So I do think it's worth reading just because it is a foundational work in this space. And so then the question becomes, how could bias in AI manifest in dermatology, which is, of course, the research question that I'm most interested in. And Dr. Ade Adamson in 2018 actually wrote this perspective piece in JAMA Dermatology, expressing initial concerns that, some of the findings that had been found in general AI that came out of the Gender Shades paper could actually also happen in dermatology, because skin tone is such an important piece in the representation of disease. And so that paper was very inspiring to me, because then my thought was, okay, let's go chase this problem empirically. Let's go figure out what's actually going on in the literature. So this is a more recent review that came out from us, a scoping review looking at whether all diseases are represented in dermatology. And what we found is that the significant amount of papers focus on lesions, on skin cancer and pigmented lesions, and that other diseases that often affect patients with skin of color, such as pigmentary disorders, are far less represented, or autoimmune diseases that often affect women are far less represented in the algorithms that are developed. And I'll just give a sort of a brief primer on how in dermatology we assess skin types. Now, this is very imperfect scale, and there are issues with it, and there are people who are trying to develop alternative scales because it's really not that inclusive of all skin tones. But briefly, there's a scale of skin that goes from skin type 1 to 6. And originally it was developed to basically be able to say like how easily somebody tans or burns in order to be able to do light based therapies on their skin. And so it wasn't actually a scale that was designed to measure color. It was actually a scale that was designed to measure photosensitivity. But over time, what's happened is that people have started to use the scale in a way that describes color. And so in addition to photosensitivity, you know, sort of like, oh, you know, very light skin, blue-green eyes, red or blonde. And so it's also incorporated sort of eye color, hair color as well. And actually the initial development of the scale did not even include dark skin tones. So that's why I say it's not a very inclusive scale. And it's not sort of broad enough to include the diversity of human skin tones. However, it is a scale that people in machine learning have been using. And in fact, this scale was used in the original gender shades paper as well. We just need a better scale, but we don't have something that people are widely using as its replacement. So I just want to kind of point out the imperfection of this scale, which I will use in subsequent descriptions of data sets, mostly because right now, as I mentioned, we don't really have an alternative scale that dermatologists are easily familiar with to use in order to label these data sets. And so in 2020, we did this scoping review to look at potential biases across AI data sets in the literature. And so we looked at peer-reviewed research papers published between 2015 and 2020 that used deep learning in dermatology, artificial intelligence in dermatology, deep learning in dermatologists, artificial intelligence in dermatologists. And we found 70, and these were papers that either developed an algorithm or tested an AI algorithm. And we found 70 papers that met the criteria. And then we have a pretty large supplement at the end of the paper where we sort of describe each paper and give information about the data set for that paper. And so as we analyzed so these are both open and closed shared publications. And so, open and closed access data sets. And when we looked at these data sets, what we found, and you can kind of visualize it here in this network graph, is that most of the data is siloed, meaning most of it is not shared, not publicly available data. And so every circle in red is a data set that is siloed. The authors do not make it public, and the authors do not state that you can access the data set by emailing them to get access to it. And the circle size also indicates sort of the size of the data set. And so it's also every square here represents a research paper. And so what you can see is that much of the research that's been generated in the AI and dermatology space are one-off papers that come from private data sets that don't get ever used anywhere else. A big exception to that, of course, is number 1 here, which represents the International Skin Imaging Collaboration data set, which is one of the largest data sets that is public. And so usually I like to show this figure and say, well, no one's really surprised that all this data is siloed. But one thing we can say from data sharing is that data sharing clearly helps, helps with increasing publications and increasing research output versus the siloed data don't really lead to much else other than one paper, and nobody can really, substantiate the findings in that paper. So the International Skin Imaging Collaboration, this is sort of the front page of the collaboration, is basically one of the premier examples of shared data in dermatology. It focuses mostly on dermoscopic data, which is data that is taken using a special device called a dermatoscope. So it's sort of magnified with special lighting. And I know probably one of our speakers will talk after this about how the majority of pretty much all the images in this data sets, which I think actually numbers above 100,000 now, depicts primarily white skin. As we looked across the 70 papers in our review, we found that a lot of these data sets likely have noisy labels and are likely not representative. So of the 56 studies that focused or had any cutaneous malignancies in them, 20 of them lacked biopsy-proven labels, meaning that the labels of malignancy or skin cancer in these data sets was done with a dermatologist consensus label, meaning dermatologists looked at the image and they labeled it as a malignancy. Nobody had biopsied the lesion to pathologically confirm that it was a malignancy. Now, why is that an issue? While dermatologists are the trained professionals that are supposed to be able to detect skin cancer, for example, for melanoma, depending on what paper you look at, the number of suspected melanomas that a dermatologist has to biopsy in order to catch a real one is somewhere between 7 and 9, maybe lower if you're a pigmented lesion specialist, and also depending on what part of the world you live in, what the frequency of melanoma is in your population. So when you hear those numbers, like, okay, you have to biopsy 7 to 9 lesions to find of suspected melanomas to find a real one, then you realize that actually these consensus labels are likely very noisy when it comes to properly labeling what is a skin cancer and what is not a skin cancer. The other thing that we found was that only 7 out of 70 studies included at least one data set with skin tone descriptors. Most of the papers had no description of the skin tones that were represented in their data. And as I mentioned before, we couldn't access most of that data to even analyze that if we wanted to analyze that information ourselves, it's not really possible because most of that data is siloed. And then the other thing I would add is of the ones that did have skin tone descriptors, the majority of those papers either did not have diverse skin tones represented or underrepresented Fitzpatrick 426 or brown and black skin tones. So definitely like not a lot of transparency in the data of many of these papers, and data not readily accessible for majority of these papers. So that was kind of the impetus behind some of the work we have subsequently done around increasing the number of diverse dermatology images. And so we built this small, but very clean sort of data set of biopsy-proven clinical images from the clinic that were de-identified and had balanced representation across the skin tones, but particularly matched Fitzpatrick 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 groups by components like age, sex, diagnosis category, time that the photograph was taken. So tried to create sort of a comparator, matched group between Fitzpatrick 1 and 2 and 5 and 6, so that people could sort of benchmark their algorithms on these groups of images. And in fact, we went and took some previously developed algorithms which had state-of-the-art performances in their original papers, ROC AUCs greater than 0.9. And what we found is that first off, there's clearly a large distribution shift between our data set and whatever data set they trained on, because performance overall plummeted. However, most concerning was that the performance was significantly worse in Fitzpatrick 5 and 6 compared to Fitzpatrick 1 and 2. The other thing we actually did, and this was actually inspired by our JAMA dermatology paper, is that we had 3 dermatologists who didn't know what the real labels were on the images, label the images as though they were the labelers for a machine learning data set task. And we found that actually, their performance overall on labeling wasn't as good as you would hope, because in dermatology, you usually don't make a diagnosis based off an image alone. And so asking them to do that for like a machine learning task is a very different thing than actual clinical practice. But we also found that the labeling had worse performance on Fitzpatrick 5 and 6 compared to Fitzpatrick 1 and 2, which is an additional source of like labeling bias if you have differential performance in labeling. And this is not too surprising for several reasons. One, as I mentioned before, historically dermatologists have a history of not having as much representation in our education of diverse skin tones. And then, of course, the other issue, which I'm not going to go into today, is that photography does not always accurately capture disease processes across diverse skin tones. And so light photography might not properly capture like the redness in an image. And so that could be another potential source of bias in image capture. And so we then tried to so using the histologically proven labels, we wanted to show whether we could close the gap in performance between the different skin tones in this. And so what we did is we then fine-tuned the model on a small subset of the images that we had from the data set. And so this also obviously helps capture some of the other distribution differences that probably exist between these data sets, some of which us as humans are not able to even, understand what some of those differences are between whatever data the original algorithm was trained on and our data set. And so what we found is, yes, you can boost model performance by fine-tuning. This is not surprising to anyone who works in machine learning. However, if you only fine-tune on images of white skin from our data set, you boost overall performance, but you will not close the performance gap between Fitzpatrick 1 and 2 and Fitzpatrick 5 and 6. That is to say that the differences that we observed in performance between white skin and brown and black skin was not driven by some other, some other thing in the differences in the distribution between the data, because it's only when you actually fine-tune on the diverse data, that is the only way that you're able to close the gap. And that is sort of making a call for having data sets that actually represent diverse skin tones, because it's very difficult to close that gap in performance when diverse skin tones are not represented in the data. So this data set, of course, I love talking about limitations of data sets. This data set has limitations like any data set does. It is a single center healthcare, Stanford Healthcare, which is a tertiary center. It's only biopsied lesions, which means that the labels are really clean, but it means that it's also enriched for challenging benign lesions, because somebody had to look at the lesion and say, hey, this lesion needs to be biopsied. It is clinical images, which include skin markings as rulers. We actually did an analysis, which is in the paper, where we looked at skin markings and rulers and made sure that that did not correlate with the difference in performance across skin tones. So it doesn't, that was not what was driving the signal. But of course, you guys know that skin markings and rulers can affect performance of algorithms. And the data is available to researchers through the Stanford Amy Center. So if you're interested in using it, feel free to go to the website and look into the data. And so what do I think is needed for fair AI in dermatology? I think we need to involve key stakeholders, patients, and communities. We need to make sure our data sets represent all groups. We need to develop ways to share data while protecting patient privacy, because patient privacy is very important. And then we need to constantly consider harms at every step, not just after developing the algorithms. And I'm happy that we will get a chance to discuss some of these issues later today.
Thank you very much.